Greetings from London. I'm sorry I'm not presenting this talk in person, but I'm grateful to the organisers for giving me the opportunity to send in this pre-recorded version. This subject is a departure for me, as I usually concentrate on textiles made in South Asia, especially India. But over the years I've become intrigued by the parallels between textiles made in India and those from Southeast Asia. This short talk explores one such relationship. When we think of tie-resist dyeing in Southeast Asia, it's the ikat technique that comes immediately to mind, as ikat is widely practiced throughout the region and has attained high status in many areas. But the related technique of tie-dyeing, or plangi, in which woven cloth is patterned by wrapping bunched up or gathered areas of the fabric in a dye-resistant material, often wrapping the cloth around a seed or some other hard, rounded object, is both less widespread in the region and less studied. In this talk, I'll briefly discuss the different types of tie-dyeing found in mainland and insular Southeast Asia. I will propose that the use of tie-dyeing falls into two distinct zones in the region, with one zone being considerably older than the other. The trade and tradition in my title refer to the different histories of tie-dyeing in these two zones, with the western zone mainly coming into existence through trade with India and the eastern zone representing an earlier tradition. I'll also discuss at what stage and from where the technique might have been introduced into this eastern zone. This opening slide illustrates the two distinct types of textile I'm referring to. On the left is a man of high status from the Bagobo community in Mindanao in the southern Philippines, in a well-known photograph published by the National Geographic in 1913. He, like other high-ranking men of his tribe, wears a jacket and trousers of abaca cloth, tie-dyed with a geometric pattern of circles arranged in rows, and a headcloth of tie-dyed cotton. This is a simple form of tie-dyeing which results in individual undyed circles set against a dyed background. By contrast, the piece on the right is a detail from a silk textile from Palembang in southeastern Sumatra, with a more complex design which clearly shows the influence of India, especially in the row of paisley patterns or butas in the centre of this detail. Also of Indian origin is the format of the whole cloth, which derives from textiles imported from India, especially the double ikat patola. The resulting textile is very far in its aesthetic from the Bagobo pieces on the left. There's also a technical difference, which is that the Sumatran piece on the right uses stitch resist or tritic to create its design, rather than simply gathering up the material and wrapping twine around it, which is how the pieces on the left were made. It's also made of imported silk rather than the locally grown and woven abaca cloth worn by the man on the left. The differences in both the aesthetic and the technical features of these two types of cloth are the basis of my suggested two zones of tie-dyeing, with one deriving from trade with India at a relatively late date and the other representing an older tradition. The origins of this suggested older tradition are almost certainly also to be found in migration or trade, but whether this was also from India, or perhaps from southern China, is a subject for discussion. This map shows my two proposed tie-dye zones. I first started looking into this subject after reading Chris Buckley's essay on his ikat line theory in the catalogue of Thomas Murray's Indonesian Textiles. In his essay, Buckley convincingly proposed the existence of an invisible line that divided the early warp ikat traditions in cotton and other plant fibres in the east of the region from the later ikat production in the western part, which also used weft ikat, often in silk. I wondered if the ikat line might coincide or overlap with a similar geographical distinction between types of tie-dyeing, and I started to collect data on the technique in the region. The result is these two proposed zones. The eastern one includes the southern Philippines, Sulawesi, and Bali and Lombok, and the western one includes Cambodia, southeastern Sumatra, and Java. Malaysia is also included in the zone as tie-dyeing was reportedly once widespread there. Tie-dyeing isn't as widespread as ikat in Southeast Asia, so a continuous dividing line couldn't be drawn between the areas where different types were made. Instead, we have these two groups or zones. Here's Chris Buckley's ikat map on the left, compared to my tie-dyed zones on the right. Both show a similar east-west split between two types of resist dyeing. Before discussing the specific types of tie dyeing in the Southeast Asian region, I'd like to give a little background on the early history of the technique in Asia, as it's from India and possibly China that the technique very likely first reached Southeast Asia. While we can't know how ancient the tradition is in Asia as a whole, we have material evidence for its manufacture and use at least from the early centuries CE. One of the main sources of this evidence is India. Although early textiles don't survive in India itself, we have the well-known documentary evidence of tie-dyeing from the 5th century wall paintings at Ajanta, like the detail on the left, which shows women in spotted tie-dyed garments circled in red in this image. This scene incidentally also includes male figures in warp ikat patterned wrapped garments. Both the tie-dyed and ikat textiles shown at Ajanta would have been locally produced. By this time, India had already been exporting textiles to other parts of Asia and the Middle East for at least several centuries, and the two fragments on the right, excavated in Egypt and in Xinjiang in Chinese Central Asia, are tiny remnants of that historic trade. While the spotted patterns on the fragment from Egypt is a genuine tie-dye, the lower fragment appears to be resist printed rather than tie-dyed, but this was clearly done in imitation of tie-dyeing. Genuine tie-dyeing was also known in Xinjiang at this early date. These three fragments are of mulberry silk, suggesting they were made in East Asia rather than India, where one would find tie-dyeing on cotton or perhaps tussar silk at this date. Aesthetically, they have a lot in common with the Indian examples and are almost certainly derived from Indian prototypes in terms of both the tie-dyeing technique and the simple spotted patterns it produced. As we will see, these pieces also have quite a lot in common visually and technically with the Southeast Asian pieces from my proposed Eastern zone, with their simple dotted patterns like the two at the centre and at the left here, or clusters of tie-dyed rhomboids like the piece on the right. But what connection could there be between these early finds from Central Asia and the tie-dyes of Southeast Asia? These come from areas much further north in Asia than southern China, from where early immigrants are thought to have brought some new textile techniques to the islands that are now the Philippines and Sulawesi. The only tie-dyeing done further south in China in more recent times is done by the Dai people of Yunnan and Sichuan, and this is very unlikely to have been part of the story of the technique's appearance in Southeast Asia. So perhaps we don't need to look to China at all for the source of tie-dyeing in the region. These same simple tie-dyed patterns were, and still are, popular in India, and were worn even by the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who was painted on several occasions wearing a short tie-dyed sash, probably of cotton, in combination with much more lavish sashes of woven silk and metal-wrapped thread, as he's shown here. This seemingly humble accessory was probably worn in honour of his mother, who came from Rajasthan, where tie-dyeing was an important way of patterning textiles, as it was in Gujarat, where the turban cloth of the same type on the right was made. Before speculating any further, I'm going to turn now to the specific types of tie-dyed textiles in Southeast Asia. First, I'd like to show some examples of tie-dyeing from areas in my eastern zones. The one I propose reflects the earlier tradition of the two. We saw this Bagobo gentleman from south-central Mindanao earlier, but here are three individual pieces that give us a clearer idea of what he's wearing, with their simple patterns made up of rows of tie-dyed circles. According to two early 20th century accounts, only priestesses of the goddess Bait Pandi were allowed to do the tie-dyeing for the Bagobo, suggesting both that the technique had high status and that it was a well-established tradition in Bagobo culture. Furthermore, only very specific people were allowed to wear tie-dyed garments like these, based on how many men the wearer had killed, the deep rust-red colouring alluding to the blood shed for the god Mandarangam. From further south in my eastern zone are these magnificent hangings or pori roto, reportedly made in Rongkong in West Sulawesi, and used by the Toraja people of the region. These bold abstract designs are, like the Bagobo pieces, made up of rows or clusters of simply tied designs with no additional use of stitch resist. The scale of these pieces is impressive, often over 4 meters or around 14 feet long. In spite of their large scale, they show unmistakable similarities with the Indian examples we just saw. With their arrangement of small dots or squares alternating or clustering around larger elements, or arranged into trellis patterns, as we see in the Toraja pieces. The long narrow format and division into zones recalls the ceremonial batik sarita also used by the Toraja in southern Sulawesi, and it may be possible that the tie-dyed examples were consciously imitating these, or vice versa. Although the sarita on the top here are usually narrower in format than the tie-dyed pori roto underneath, there's a striking similarity between them in terms of how the designs are compartmentalized, with large circles alternating with panels of smaller motifs. Still in my eastern zone, the Sasak people of Bali and Lombok produce these silk textiles, which are quite similar in design and layout to the Toraja pieces, with their long narrow format and division into horizontal zones, as well as their use of simple tie-dyed circles and lines to create dramatic patterns. Once again, no stitch resist is used. The designs are all made by wrapping bunches of cloth to resist the dye. Also on the southern fringes of our eastern zone are the cotton tie-dyed shrouds made by the Savunese people. This one was made on the neighbouring island of Raijua and clearly fits into the tradition of simple dotted cloths that we've seen in the early Indian pieces. These three details, all of pieces from the eastern zone, show the absence of needle holes and therefore the lack of stitch resist on these pieces. Although I suspect my images might not be clear enough for this to be visible, I can quote Alfred Bühler, the great authority on resist-dyed textiles, who also noted in his 1954 essay on Plangi that no stitch resist was used in the Bali and Lombok tie-dyed silks. These three pieces exemplify the style of the eastern zone, simple circle-based tie-dyed patterns arranged to make abstract designs. I'm now going to move on to the pieces from my proposed western zone, which is on the left here, obviously, mainly covering Cambodia, Southeast Sumatra, and Java. These two tie-dyed textiles are from southern Cambodia. They're made of imported Chinese silk by members of the Cham community, who originated in central Vietnam, but who migrated to Cambodia around the 13th to 15th century, when their kingdom of Champa was invaded by the Vietnamese. They converted to Shia Islam in the 15th or 16th century. Tie-dyeing is also associated with the people of Malay descent, who also migrated to Cambodia and who frequently intermarried with the Muslim Cham. The designs on these two typical pieces are clearly derived from Indian prototypes. The format of a central rectangular field with a border around all four sides is typical of Indian wrapped garments such as the saris, shoulder cloths, dhotis, and lungis. The Indian patola on the left, made for export to Southeast Asia, shows not only the format of the rectangular field of four side borders, but also the geometric field patterns, which also find a parallel in the two Cambodian pieces alongside it here. Their end borders show stylized trees or tumpals, which evolved through interaction with other Indian trade goods with this end border motif. Also made by the Muslim Cham people are these finely tie-dyed headcloths, often made on imported damask-woven Chinese silk. Although in a square rather than rectangular format, they also use the all-over trellis design of the larger shawls. Very similar in format and design to the rectangular Cambodian pieces are these typical examples from Palembang in southeast Sumatra. They too follow the Indian format of a rectangular field with borders on all four sides, but where the Cambodian pieces usually have triangular tree forms or tumpals at the ends, The Palembang style prefers to incorporate a row of Indian-derived buttas or paisley patterns, as you can see in the end borders of all three of these pieces. This distinctive pattern developed in North India from around the late 17th century and is especially associated with Kashmir shawls, in which the butta motif evolved from a single naturalistic flower to the stylized form we see in 19th century shawls like the one on the right here. This particular shape of butta, with an exaggerated tip bending over to the left and an infilling design of branches or flowers, developed around the 1820s to 30s and was popular until the middle of the 19th century, before it developed into an even more elongated and stylized floral pattern. This is precisely the type of design found on the Palembang tie-dyed silk shawls like the one on the left. The pattern need not have come directly from Kashmir shawls, which are unlikely to have been traded to tropical Sumatra. Rather, the motif was used across all types of Indian textile at the time, from printed cotton to embroidery and woven silk and metal-wrapped thread textiles. So the design was very widespread in terms of textile types, but very specifically of the period around 1820 to 1850, which is likely to have been when it was introduced into Sumatran tie-dyed silk textiles. More directly relevant to the Palembang paisley design than the shawl are Indian textiles like the two lower ones here. The one on the left with tie-dyed buttas in the same distinctive shape as the Palembang piece above it, and the right-hand textile showing a similar design in which the tie-dyed pattern is imitated in block printing. These textiles were made in Gujarat, which had been one of the main centres of textile exports from India for centuries. They are certainly of a type that could have been traded to Southeast Asia throughout the 19th century, both in genuine tie-dyed form as well as in printed imitations. Another type of tie-dyed shawl developed in Palembang, in which the central field is left empty, while retaining the end borders of rows of buttas like the piece on the left here. These evolved into an even more sparsely decorated type, like those in the centre and right, in which tritic is used to create a fine white line dividing two or three plain colours. This is the type known to modern-day dealers as lawan, a term of so far unidentified origin. These have unmistakable similarities to textiles from neighbouring Java. The upper image is a Javanese breastcloth, which combines batik borders with a stitch-resist tritic centre field. Below is a much simpler man's head wrapper, identified on the early 20th century paper label still attached to it as kain kembangan, or tie-dye work, which is not strictly accurate as the design is made in tritic, not plangi. It's also described on the label as a kain kapala, or headcloth worn by noblemen at court. Although here it's shown folded in half, it's clearly a square with a diamond-shaped centre, very like the plain-coloured tritic pieces from Palembang. Kain kembangan from Java were recorded by Europeans as early as 1580 and were described as being worn at the court of Mataram in central Java in 1654, so they clearly carried high status. The use of tritic in the pieces made in my proposed Western zone is a dominant part of their patterning. In some cases, like this kain kembangan, the only method of patterning. I hope this detail is clear enough for you to see needle holes in the white jagged line dividing the two colours. As Alfred Bühler noted, rather surprisingly in Java, tritic stitch resist seems to be more traditional than plangi or tie-dyeing, which is only done on the coasts and is associated with Indian connections. Tritic can also be seen in the Cambodian piece we saw earlier. It's most visible in the areas I've circled in white here. And again in this piece from Palembang and Sumatra. So all the examples from my Western zone use tritic, unlike the purely tie-dyed pieces in the Eastern zone. To conclude, the visual and material differences between the Eastern and Western zone types of tie-dyeing and stitch resist are reasonably easy to sum up. Simple circle-based designs in true tie-dye or plangi in the Eastern zone on the right, and more elaborate Indian-derived patterns in a combination of plangi and tritic in the Western on the left. More difficult to establish of the origins and age of each type. When I started gathering this material together, I half expected to find some connection with southern China in relation to the eastern zone's spotted textiles, which I suspected had been introduced at an early date. Migrations from southern China and Taiwan have sometimes been cited as key to some of the earliest developments in Southeast Asia's textile history, especially those of bark cloth and warp ikat, but I found no plausible Chinese connection for tie-dyeing. Instead, I think it's more likely that we're looking at India as the source of both the earlier and the later traditions of tie-dyeing in the two zones, with the simple spotted patterns being developed into the extraordinary banners of Sulawesi, the garments of warriors from the Philippines, and the dance costumes and hangings of Bali and Lombok, and the more elaborate designs with their patola formats and some with paisley patterns coming to the Western zone at a later date. While I suspect that the use of tritic and the rectangular format with borders could have reached Southeast Asia around the 16th or 17th century, the paisley motifs can only have been introduced in the 19th. As we saw earlier, the simple form of tie-dyed design as used in the Eastern Zone was known to have been traded from India at least by the 3rd century, but when and how it might have reached the southern Philippines and Sulawesi is yet to be discovered. Not quite every type of tie-dyeing in the region can be neatly slotted into my two zones. One anomaly is the use of elaborate tritic patterned abaka by the Kulaman people of the southern Philippines, a region which otherwise fits into my eastern triticless zone. But human geography and trade can't always be expected to conform rigidly to external theories. I hope that in the future, anthropologists, linguists and historians may add their own more scientific findings to these my very initial and preliminary thoughts on tie-dyeing in Southeast Asia. Thank you.